The baby's cries echoed through the dusty courthouse in Fort Kearney, Nebraska, on that sweltering July morning in 1878, and Nora Jenkins clutched her 6-month-old son tighter as 3 well-dressed men seated across the aisle glared at her with cold calculation. She had never felt more alone in her 22 years, widowed just 8 months earlier when her husband Thomas died in a ranching accident. And now his wealthy family wanted to take away the only thing she had left in this world. The Hutchinson family sat in their fine Eastern clothes, looking completely out of place in this frontier town, their lawyer shuffling papers with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case. Nora's threadbare dress and work-worn hands told a different story than theirs, one of survival and struggle, and she knew the judge would see the contrast as clearly as everyone else in that packed courtroom. She had spent the last 3 days sick with worry, unable to eat or sleep, knowing that Thomas's parents believed she was unfit to raise their grandson simply because she had to work to survive. They had money, position, and power back in Philadelphia, and they wanted to bring little Samuel back there to raise him as a proper gentleman. Never mind that she had carried him, birthed him, and loved him every moment of his short life. Never mind that Thomas had loved her desperately and would have been horrified at what his parents were trying to do. The Hutchinsons had made it clear they believed their son had married beneath himself when he fell for a rancher's daughter out west, and now they intended to correct that mistake. The courthouse doors swung open with a creak that made everyone turn, and a tall figure stepped inside, his boots striking the wooden floor with purpose. Nora did not recognize him at first, this cowboy with sun-darkened skin and intense blue eyes, his hat in his hands and his expression serious. He wore clean but simple clothes, a working man's attire, and something about the set of his shoulders suggested he was not someone who backed down easily. He scanned the room until his gaze landed on her, and for a moment their eyes met with an intensity that made her breath catch. Samuel Stone had been riding fence line on the Morrison Ranch, 3 miles outside of town, when he heard about the custody hearing from one of the hands who had been in Fort Kearney for supplies. The story had made his blood boil, this tale of a young widow being harassed by wealthy in-laws who wanted to steal her child. He knew Nora slightly, had seen her in town a few times, remembered her husband as a decent man who had worked hard to build a life for his family. Samuel was 30 years old and had spent the last 12 years working cattle drives and ranches across the West, and he had seen enough injustice to recognize it when he heard about it. He had not planned to get involved, had told himself it was none of his business, but something would not let him ride away. Maybe it was the memory of his own mother, who had raised him alone after his father died when Samuel was just a boy. Maybe it was the principle of the thing, seeing powerful people try to crush someone who could not fight back. Whatever the reason, he had cleaned up, rode into town, and now stood in this courthouse with his heart hammering and his mind racing through everything he knew about the situation. Judge Morrison called the court to order, and the Hutchinson lawyer stood with practiced ease. His name was Edward Crane, and he spoke with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to winning. He painted a picture of Nora as a struggling woman living in poverty, unable to provide proper education or opportunities for the child, forced to work long hours that meant the baby was often left with neighbors. He talked about the advantages the Hutchinsons could provide, the finest schools in Philadelphia, social connections, a life of comfort and security. His words were calculated to make it sound like taking Samuel away was actually an act of mercy, the loving thing to do. Nora felt tears burning her eyes as she listened, knowing that much of what he said was technically true even if it painted a completely false picture. Yes, she worked hard, taking in laundry and mending to make ends meet. Yes, her neighbor Mrs. Patterson sometimes watched Samuel when Nora had to make deliveries. But she loved her son with every fiber of her being, sang to him every night, made sure he was fed and clean and happy. The poverty they lived in was temporary, something she was fighting through, not a permanent condition. But how could she make the judge understand that? Her own lawyer, a young man named Peter Webb who had only been practicing for 2 years, did his best to counter Crane's arguments. He spoke about a mother's love, about the importance of a child knowing his real parent, about Nora's strong character and determination. But his words lacked the polish and power of Crane's presentation, and Nora could see Judge Morrison's expression growing more troubled as the arguments continued. The judge was a fair man, but he was also practical, and she feared he would decide that the child's material welfare outweighed everything else. That was when Samuel Stone stood up in court. The movement was so sudden and unexpected that everyone turned to stare at him. Judge Morrison frowned and raised his gavel, clearly about to demand order, but Samuel spoke before he could. "Your Honor, I ask permission to speak on behalf of Mrs. Jenkins." His voice was deep and steady, with none of the nervousness Nora felt coursing through her own veins. "And who might you be?" Judge Morrison asked, his tone skeptical but not entirely dismissive. "My name is Samuel Stone, Your Honor. I am a rancher and I have known the Jenkins family for the past year. I have information relevant to this case that the court needs to hear." The judge studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Mr. Stone. You may approach and give your testimony, but be warned I will not tolerate any disruption of these proceedings." Samuel walked forward, his boots echoing in the suddenly silent courtroom. He did not look at the Hutchinsons or their lawyer, only at the judge, and then briefly at Nora with an expression that somehow managed to be both reassuring and determined. When he reached the witness area, he turned to face the room, and Nora could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped his hat. "Your Honor, I have listened to Mr. Crane paint a picture of Mrs. Jenkins as someone unfit to raise her child, and I cannot let that stand unchallenged. I have watched this woman over the past months, seen her struggle and sacrifice and fight to build a life for her son. After her husband died, she could have given up. She could have gone back to her own family in Wyoming. But she stayed here because this was the home she and Thomas built together, and she was determined to honor his memory by raising their child in the place his father loved." He paused, and Nora saw something flicker in his eyes, some emotion that seemed almost personal despite the fact that they barely knew each other. "I have seen her working late into the night by lamplight, taking in extra mending to make sure she could pay her rent. I have seen her carry that baby 3 miles to the doctor when he had a fever, walking the whole way because she had no horse. I have watched her turn down charity because she has her pride, but never once turned down honest work no matter how hard it might be. That is not poverty of character, Your Honor. That is strength." Edward Crane stood up, objecting smoothly. "Your Honor, Mr. Stone's observations about Mrs. Jenkins's character while touching do not change the fundamental facts of the case. The child would have significant material advantages with the Hutchinson family." Samuel turned to face the lawyer directly, and there was something fierce in his expression that made Crane take a small step back. "Material advantages? You mean money?" "Well, let me tell you something about money, Mr. Crane. I have worked for rich men and poor men, and I can tell you that money does not make a man worth a damn. Thomas Jenkins did not have much when he died, but he was worth 10 of most men I have known. He loved his wife, and he would be sick to his soul to see what his parents are trying to do here today." Objection. Crane's voice rose. "The witness cannot possibly know what the deceased would have wanted." "Actually, I can," Samuel said, and now he looked directly at Nora, his blue eyes intense. "Because Thomas Jenkins told me himself, 3 weeks before he died. We were working together on a barn raising for the Henderson family, and we got to talking the way men do. He told me how his parents had never approved of his marriage, how they thought he should have stayed in Philadelphia and married someone from their social circle. He told me that the best decision he ever made was choosing love over money, choosing a real life out here over the empty one they wanted for him." Nora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She remembered Thomas talking about that barn raising, remembered him coming home tired but happy. She had not known Samuel Stone was there, had not known her husband had confided in him. Samuel continued, his voice strong and clear. "Thomas told me that if anything ever happened to him, his greatest fear was that his parents would try to take his child away from Nora. He made me promise that if I ever heard of such a thing, I would do whatever I could to stop it. I gave him my word, Your Honor. A man's word means something out here, and I intend to keep mine." The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs. Judge Morrison banged his gavel for silence, but Nora could see that Samuel's words had affected him. The judge leaned forward, studying Samuel carefully. "That is a serious claim, Mr. Stone. Do you have any proof of this conversation?" "Only my word, Your Honor, and the word of Jake Henderson, who was also present for part of the conversation. He is outside if you want to call him in." Samuel's gaze did not waver. Edward Crane stood again, his smooth demeanor showing the first cracks of frustration. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Even if this conversation took place, it does not change the fact that Mrs. Jenkins is living in poverty and cannot provide for the child's future." Samuel turned on him, and now there was real anger in his voice. "Cannot provide. She provides love, stability, and a mother's care. What are you offering? A train ride to a city where the boy will never know where he came from, raised by people who thought his father made a mistake by loving his mother. You think that is better?" "Mr. Stone, please control yourself," Judge Morrison warned, but there was less heat in his tone than there might have been. Samuel took a breath, clearly fighting to master his emotions. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer but no less intense. "Your Honor, I apologize for my outburst. But I cannot stand here and watch an injustice without speaking up. This court needs to understand what is really happening here. The Hutchinsons do not want to raise this child out of love. They want him because he is their legacy, their blood, and they cannot stand the idea of him being raised by someone they consider beneath them." Old Mr. Hutchinson stood up at that, his face red. "How dare you? We loved our son." "Then honor what he wanted," Samuel shot back. "Honor the choice he made when he married Nora. Honor the life he built out here away from you. If you truly loved him, you would not be trying to undo everything he worked for." Judge Morrison banged his gavel hard. "That is enough. Everyone sit down and be silent, or I will clear this courtroom." He waited until order was restored, then looked at Samuel. "Mr. Stone, you have made your feelings clear. Do you have anything else to add that is directly relevant to Mrs. Jenkins's fitness as a mother?" Samuel nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter but somehow more powerful for it. "Yes, Your Honor. I want to address the question of Mrs. Jenkins's financial situation, because that seems to be the main concern. It is true that she is struggling now, but circumstances can change. If this court is worried about her ability to provide, then those circumstances can be improved." He paused, and Nora saw him take a deep breath, as if gathering courage for what he was about to say. "I own a ranch 15 miles west of here, Your Honor. It is not large, but it is profitable." I have 200 head of cattle, good grazing land, and a solid house. I came here today prepared to offer Mrs. Jenkins employment as my housekeeper, which would provide her with steady income and a place to live while she raises her son. But as I have sat here and listened to these proceedings, I have realized that such an arrangement might still leave her vulnerable to future challenges from the Hutchinson family. Nora's heart was pounding now, her mind racing to understand where he was going with this. Samuel turned to look at her directly, and there was something in his eyes that made the whole courtroom seem to fade away. So instead, Your Honor, I would like to make a different proposal. Mrs. Jenkins, I am asking you here and now to marry me. As my wife, you would have the financial security and social standing to ensure that no one could ever question your right to raise your son. You would have a home, protection, and a future. The courtroom exploded in shocked exclamations. Nora felt the world spinning around her, unable to process what she had just heard. This man, this stranger who had walked into the courthouse and defended her with such passion, was proposing marriage. Judge Morrison was banging his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Edward Crane was on his feet objecting, though to what was unclear. The Hutchinsons looked stunned and furious in equal measure. But Samuel Stone just stood there, his eyes on Nora, waiting for her answer. "Mr. Stone, this is highly irregular," Judge Morrison said when he finally restored order. "You cannot simply propose marriage in the middle of a court proceeding as a solution to a custody case." "Why not, Your Honor?" Samuel asked, never taking his eyes off Nora. "The court is concerned about Mrs. Jenkins's ability to provide for her child. I am offering a legitimate solution to that concern. If she accepts, she would be married to a man of good standing in this community with adequate means to support a family. That changes the entire nature of this case." Peter Webb, Nora's lawyer, stood up quickly. "Your Honor, Mr. Stone makes a valid point. If Mrs. Jenkins were to remarry, particularly to someone with established resources, it would indeed address many of the concerns raised by the plaintiffs." Edward Crane's face was red with frustration. "This is absurd. You cannot expect this woman to marry a virtual stranger just to keep her child." "No one is expecting anything," Samuel said calmly. "I am offering a choice. Mrs. Jenkins is free to accept or decline. But she should have the right to make that choice before this court makes a decision that will affect the rest of her life and her son's life." Judge Morrison looked at Nora, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Jenkins, this is your decision. No one can force you to accept or reject this proposal. But I will say that if you were to marry Mr. Stone, it would significantly impact my ruling on this custody matter. Do you understand?" Nora found her voice finally, though it shook. "May I speak with Mr. Stone privately for a moment, Your Honor?" The judge nodded. "You may use the side room." "You have 5 minutes." Nora stood on trembling legs, her baby held close to her chest. Samuel moved toward her, and together they walked to the small side room the judge had indicated. Once the door closed behind them, Nora turned to face this man who had just turned her world upside down. "Why?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why would you do this for me? You do not even know me." Samuel set his hat down on the small table in the room and ran a hand through his dark hair. "I know enough. I know you are brave and strong. I know you love your son. I know Thomas thought you were worth leaving everything behind for. But marriage—" Nora shook her head, trying to clear the confusion. "That is not something to be entered into lightly, especially not for reasons like this." "I agree," Samuel said quietly. "And I want you to understand something, Nora. If you say yes, I am not expecting a real marriage right away. You would have your own room. You could take all the time you need to grieve your husband and adjust to this new situation. I would never force myself on you or expect anything you were not ready to give. This would be a marriage in name for legal protection, until and unless you decided you wanted it to be more. Nora stared at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. But why would you tie yourself to a widow with a child? You could find someone else, someone without all these complications. Something flickered across Samuel's face, a shadow of old pain. I am 30 years old, Nora. I have been on my own since I was 18, working ranches, saving money, building something I can be proud of. But a ranch is not a home when you are living in it alone. I have watched other men build families while I built fences. Maybe it is time I did something different. He took a step closer, and Nora could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. I will be honest with you, he continued. I have noticed you before, around town. I thought you were pretty and kind, and I admired how you held your head up even when things were hard. I never approached you because you were married, and I respect that boundary absolutely. But I would be lying if I said I had not thought about what it might be like to know you better. When I heard about what was happening today, it felt like fate was giving me a chance to do something good and maybe, if I am lucky, find something good for myself too. Nora felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Samuel was offering her salvation, but more than that, he was being honest about his motivations. He was not pretending to be a selfless hero. He was a lonely man seeing a possibility for a future that included companionship and family. What about Samuel? She asked, looking down at her sleeping son. He is not your child. Could you accept him as yours? I would be honored to raise Thomas Jenkins's son, Samuel said firmly. Any boy lucky enough to have you as a mother is already starting life with an advantage. And any boy who is part of you is someone I would be proud to call my own. The words broke something loose in Nora's chest, something that had been locked tight since Thomas died. She had been so alone, so afraid, and now here was this man offering her a lifeline. It was not what she had imagined for her future, but then nothing about the last 8 months had been what she imagined. If I say yes, she said slowly, I need you to promise me something, anything. Promise me that you will never make me regret this. Promise me that you will be good to my son, and that you will give me time to learn who you are before you expect me to be a real wife to you. Samuel nodded solemnly. I promise both those things. And I promise one more thing, Nora. I promise that I will do everything in my power to make you happy. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but someday. That is my goal. Nora took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Then yes, Samuel Stone, I will marry you. The relief that flooded Samuel's face was unmistakable, and Nora realized that despite his calm demeanor, he had been genuinely worried she would refuse. He smiled at her, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something warmer and more open. Thank you, he said quietly. You will not regret this, I swear it. They returned to the courtroom hand in hand, and the moment they walked through the door, everyone seemed to know what the answer had been. Judge Morrison called for order and looked at them expectantly. Your Honor, Samuel said clearly, Mrs. Jenkins has agreed to become my wife. We would like to be married as soon as possible so that this custody matter can be resolved. Edward Crane was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, you cannot possibly allow this farce to influence your decision. This is clearly a marriage of convenience designed solely to circumvent the legitimate concerns of the Hutchinson family. Judge Morrison held up his hand for silence. Mr. Crane, people get married for many reasons, and the law does not require that romantic love be among them. If Mrs. Jenkins wishes to marry Mr. Stone, that is her right. And yes, it does impact this case significantly. He looked at the Hutchinsons, his expression stern. Mr. and Mrs. Hutchinson, I understand your concerns about your grandson's welfare. However, the fact remains that Nora Jenkins is the child's mother and has shown no signs of abuse or neglect. The only argument against her has been financial instability, which will be resolved by her marriage to Mr. Stone. Therefore, I am ruling that Samuel Jenkins will remain in his mother's custody. Mrs. Hutchinson burst into tears and her husband stood angrily. This is not over. We will appeal this decision. That is your right, Judge Morrison said calmly, but I doubt you will find success. A higher court will respect a mother's rights even more strongly than I do, especially when she is married and stable. My advice to you would be to accept this ruling and work toward building a relationship with your daughter-in-law and grandson based on mutual respect, rather than legal coercion. Edward Crane gathered his papers with barely controlled fury, and the Hutchinsons swept out of the courtroom without looking back. Nora sagged with relief, and Samuel's arm came around her shoulders to steady her. "It is over," he said quietly. "You won. He is yours." Nora looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "We won. I could not have done this without you." Judge Morrison cleared his throat. "Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Stone, I can perform the marriage ceremony right now if you wish. It would make the legal situation clearer and eliminate any possibility of the Hutchinsons causing further trouble before you can be officially wed." Nora and Samuel looked at each other, and something passed between them, an understanding that they were stepping off a cliff together and hoping they would both land safely. "Yes, Your Honor," Samuel said. "We would like that." And so Nora Jenkins married Samuel Stone in a dusty courthouse in Fort Kearny, Nebraska, on a hot July afternoon in 1878, with her baby son in her arms and a courtroom full of curious townspeople as witnesses. There were no flowers, no wedding dress, no celebration. Just two people speaking vows that would bind them together and hoping they had made the right choice. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel leaned down and kissed Nora's forehead gently, a chaste kiss that was more promise than passion. She closed her eyes and let herself lean into him for just a moment, absorbing his strength and warmth. They left the courthouse together, and the townspeople parted to let them through. Nora could feel the weight of curious eyes following them, knew that this story would be told and retold throughout Fort Kearny for months to come. The widow who kept her child by marrying a cowboy in court. It sounded like something out of a dime novel, too dramatic to be real. Yet here she was living it. Samuel had his horse tied outside, a good sturdy bay gelding. He helped Nora up into the saddle, handed her the baby, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her to hold the reins, and Nora was suddenly very aware of the solid warmth of his chest against her back. "I need to collect my things from my house," she said softly. "We will get them tomorrow," Samuel replied. "Tonight you both need to rest, and I want you safely at the ranch in case the Hutchinsons get any ideas about causing more trouble." The ride to Samuel's ranch took nearly an hour, and Nora spent it in a daze, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning she had woken up alone, terrified that she would lose her son. Now she was married to a man she barely knew, heading toward a new life she could not even imagine. Little Samuel woke halfway through the ride and started to fuss, and Nora rocked him gently while Samuel made soothing sounds that surprised her with their natural ease. When they arrived at the ranch, Nora was relieved to see that Samuel had not exaggerated his circumstances. The house was modest but solid, built of good timber with a stone chimney and a covered porch. There was a barn, a chicken coop, and corrals that showed signs of good maintenance. It was not wealthy by any means, but it was comfortable and well kept. Samuel helped her down from the horse and showed her inside. The house had 3 rooms, a main living area with a kitchen space and 2 bedrooms. It was clean but sparse, the home of a man who lived alone and spent most of his time working. "The larger bedroom is yours now," Samuel said, setting her bag down inside the door. "I will take the smaller one. There is a cradle in the corner there that I borrowed from the Henderson family this afternoon. I figured the baby would need somewhere to sleep." Nora stared at the cradle, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Samuel had gone to the courthouse prepared to offer her help, had thought ahead to what a baby would need. This man who was now her husband was clearly someone who paid attention to details. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Samuel nodded, looking suddenly awkward. "Are you hungry? I am not much of a cook, but I can manage beans and bread." "I can cook," Nora said automatically, then felt foolish. Of course she could cook. That was not the point. "Not tonight," Samuel said firmly. "Tonight you rest. You have been through enough today." He made them a simple meal while Nora fed the baby and got him settled in the unfamiliar cradle. Samuel ate quickly and excused himself, saying he needed to check on the cattle. Nora suspected he was really giving her space to adjust, and she was grateful for his sensitivity. When she was alone, Nora finally let herself cry, great heaving sobs of relief and fear and exhaustion. She had kept her son. She was safe. But she was also bound to a stranger, living in an unfamiliar house, with no idea what the future would hold. It was too much to process, too much to feel. Eventually the tears stopped, and Nora found herself simply sitting in the quiet house, listening to her baby breathe. She looked around the room that was now hers, seeing small touches that told her about the man she had married. A book on the bedside table, Moby Dick. A photograph on the wall of a woman who must have been his mother, based on the resemblance. A quilt on the bed that was worn but carefully mended, showing that Samuel knew how to take care of his possessions. When Samuel returned an hour later, Nora had composed herself. He knocked softly on her door frame, though it was open, and asked if she needed anything. "I am fine," she assured him. "Samuel, I want you to know that I understand what you did for me today. You saved my life, or at least everything that makes my life worth living. I will try to be a good wife to you." He shook his head. "You do not owe me anything, Nora. I made a choice based on what I thought was right. Now we both have to live with that choice and make the best of it, but I do not want you to feel indebted to me. That is not the kind of marriage I want." "What kind of marriage do you want?" Nora asked quietly. Samuel leaned against the door frame, considering the question. "The kind where 2 people respect each other and work together. The kind where maybe, over time, we become friends. And if we are really lucky, the kind where friendship turns into something more. But that takes time, and I have plenty of patience." Nora felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a tiny seed of hope. "I think I would like that too." "Good. Then we agree. Now get some rest. Tomorrow we can go get your things from town and start figuring out how this is going to work." The next weeks passed in a strange adjustment period. Nora moved her few possessions into Samuel's house and tried to make it feel like home. She took over the cooking and cleaning, not because Samuel demanded it, but because she needed to feel useful and earn her place. Samuel continued his work on the ranch, but made a point of coming in for meals and spending time in the house rather than staying outside until exhaustion drove him to bed. They talked during those evening hours, tentative at first, then with growing ease. Nora learned that Samuel had been born in Missouri, that his father had died of cholera when Samuel was 8, that his mother had worked herself to death trying to keep their small farm running. He had left at 18 to work cattle drives, spending 10 years moving from ranch to ranch, before saving enough to buy this piece of land 3 years ago. Samuel learned that Nora had grown up in Wyoming, the youngest daughter of a rancher with 4 sons and 3 daughters. She had met Thomas at a dance in Cheyenne, had fallen in love with his gentle nature and quick laugh. They had married after a brief courtship and moved to Nebraska to start their own ranch. His death had been sudden and senseless, his horse spooked by a rattlesnake, Thomas thrown and his neck broken in the fall. As they shared their histories, something began to grow between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was connection. They were both people who had known loss and loneliness, who valued hard work and honesty. They made each other laugh sometimes, usually over small domestic disasters like burnt biscuits or chickens escaping the coop. Samuel was remarkably good with baby Samuel, whom they had started calling Sam to avoid confusion. He would hold the boy in the evenings, bouncing him gently while Nora cleaned up after supper. He sang to him sometimes, old trail songs in a surprisingly pleasant baritone. When Sam had a fever from teething, Samuel rode 6 miles to fetch the doctor without being asked. Nora watched her husband during these weeks, seeing new facets of his character revealed daily. He was patient and kind, but also firm when necessary. He had a wry sense of humor that caught her off guard. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, never made her feel pressured to be a proper wife in the physical sense. True to his word, he slept in the smaller bedroom and treated her with respectful courtesy. But Nora was beginning to realize that her feelings were changing. When Samuel came in from a long day's work, dusty and tired, she found herself noticing the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders. When he smiled at her over dinner, she felt warmth spreading through her chest. When he played with Sam, making the baby giggle with delight, she felt something tender and aching take root in her heart. She had loved Thomas deeply, and part of her felt guilty for these new feelings. But Thomas was gone, and Samuel was here, solid and real and increasingly dear to her. She began to wonder if he felt the same growing awareness, if he noticed the way she had started touching his arm when she talked to him, the way she lingered in the kitchen when he came in for breakfast. 2 months after their courthouse wedding, autumn came to Nebraska in a blaze of golden light. The cattle were fattening on the last good grass before winter, and Samuel was working long days to prepare the ranch for the cold months ahead. Nora had transformed the house in small ways, adding curtains she had sewn, planting herbs in boxes on the porch, filling the space with the warmth of a real home. One evening, Samuel came in earlier than usual and found Nora in the kitchen making preserves from the wild plums she had gathered. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair escaping from its pins, and there was a smudge of plum juice on her cheek. She looked flushed and happy, humming to herself while Sam played with wooden blocks on a blanket nearby. Samuel stood in the doorway watching her, and something in his expression made Nora's hand still. She turned to face him fully, suddenly breathless. "What is it?" she asked. He crossed the room slowly, never taking his eyes from her face. "I need to tell you something, Nora." Her heart began to pound. "All right. When I married you, I told myself it was the right thing to do. I told myself I was helping someone who needed help and maybe getting a companion out of the deal. I told myself not to expect anything more than that." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "But I was lying to myself." "About what?" Nora whispered. "About what I wanted. About what I was already starting to feel even then." He reached up and gently wiped the plum juice from her cheek with his thumb. "I am falling in love with you, Nora. Maybe I started falling that day in the courthouse, or maybe it began even earlier. I do not know. But it is happening, and I cannot pretend anymore that this is just a marriage of convenience for me." Nora felt tears prickling her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "Samuel, I need to tell you something too." He waited, his blue eyes searching her face. I love Thomas. He was my first love, and I will always be grateful for the time we had together. But he is gone, and you are here. And somewhere in these past 2 months, you stopped being just the man who saved me. You became the man I look for when I wake up, the man whose smile makes my day better, the man I trust completely with my son and with my heart. She reached up and placed her hand over his where it still rested against her cheek. I am falling in love with you too. And I do not want to sleep in separate bedrooms anymore. I do not want a marriage in name only. I want a real marriage with you if you still want that with me. The joy that flooded Samuel's face was beautiful to see. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste forehead kiss from their wedding day. This kiss was deep and passionate, full of 2 months of longing and restraint finally released. Nora melted into him, her arms coming up around his neck, and felt like she was coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel rushed or pressured." "I am sure," Nora said firmly. "I want this. I want you." That night, for the first time, they came together as true husband and wife. Samuel was patient and gentle, mindful of the fact that it had been a long time for Nora and that she was still healing from childbirth. He made her feel cherished and desired, and when she fell asleep in his arms afterward, she felt a sense of contentment she had thought she might never experience again. Life settled into a new rhythm after that night. They moved into the larger bedroom together, and Nora moved Sam's cradle in with them. Samuel continued his ranch work, but now he had Nora riding out with him sometimes when weather permitted, Sam bundled up and secured in a sling against her chest. They worked side by side repairing fences, checking on cattle, planning for the future. Winter came hard that year, with deep snows that kept them close to the house for days at a time. But those days were not lonely or frightening as Nora's first winter as a widow had been. Now she had Samuel to keep her warm at night, to shovel paths through the snow, to play with Sam by the fire while she cooked. They read to each other in the evenings, talked about everything and nothing, made love with increasing confidence and passion. By the time spring arrived in 1879, Nora knew she was pregnant again. She told Samuel one morning over breakfast, watching his face carefully to see how he would react. He had been wonderful with Sam, but this would be his first biological child. Samuel's face lit up with pure joy. He came around the table and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around gently. "Are you sure?" "When? I am sure. I think around September. A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Nora asked, though she could see the answer in his face. Happy does not begin to cover it. "I feel like the luckiest man alive." That summer, they worked together to expand the house, adding on another room that would serve as a nursery once the new baby arrived, and Sam was old enough for his own bed. Samuel hired a young man from town to help with the ranch work, wanting to be sure he would be available when Nora's time came. In late September, Nora went into labor. The same doctor who had treated Sam's teething fever came out to the ranch and helped deliver a healthy baby girl. When Samuel held his daughter for the first time, Nora saw tears streaming down his face. "She is perfect," he whispered. "What should we name her?" Nora had thought about this. "I want to name her after your mother. What was her name?" Samuel looked at her with such love that it took her breath away. "Sarah. Her name was Sarah. Then this is Sarah Stone." Little Sarah was an easy baby, happy and calm, and Sam was fascinated by his new sister. Nora watched her family grow and flourish, watched Samuel become the father he had always wanted to be, and felt a deep gratitude for the strange path that had brought them together. The Hutchinsons never did appeal the custody decision. They sent a stiff letter 6 months after the wedding requesting permission to visit their grandson. Samuel and Nora discussed it at length and agreed that they would not deny Sam knowledge of his father's family, even if they disagreed with the Hutchinsons' methods. The first visit was awkward and tense, but over time the relationship eased. The Hutchinsons eventually acknowledged that Sam was happy and well cared for, and their visits became less about trying to reclaim him and more about simply knowing their grandson. Years passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. The ranch prospered under Samuel's management and Nora's careful planning. They added more cattle, improved their breeding stock, built a better barn. Sam grew into a strong, bright boy who loved helping his father with the ranch work. Sarah was followed by another son, then another daughter, each one welcomed with joy. By 1885, Nora was 30 years old and had 4 children who filled the house with laughter and chaos. Samuel was 37, his dark hair starting to show threads of silver, his face weathered by years of outdoor work but still handsome to Nora's eyes. They had been married 7 years, and sometimes Nora could barely remember what her life had been like before him. One evening that summer, after the children were all in bed, Samuel and Nora sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Samuel had his arm around Nora, and she was tucked against his side in the comfortable way of long married couples. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked suddenly. "Regret what?" Saying yes that day in the courthouse, taking a chance on a stranger. Nora turned to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes despite all these years together. "Never, not once. Do you regret asking me?" "No. But sometimes I cannot believe how lucky I was that you said yes. I think about how close I came to not going to that courthouse, to telling myself it was none of my business. If I had made that choice, I would have missed out on everything that matters most in my life." Nora reached up and cupped his face in her hand. "But you did not make that choice. You stood up in court and defended me when no one else would. You gave me my son, but more than that, you gave me yourself. You gave me this life, this family, this love. I thank God every day for the man you are." Samuel kissed her then, a long, slow kiss that still had the power to make her heart race even after all these years. When they pulled apart, he smiled at her with that particular expression that still turned her insides to liquid. "I love you, Nora Stone." "I love you too, Samuel Stone." More than I ever thought possible. They sat there as darkness fell, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the sounds of their ranch settling for the night. Somewhere inside the house, one of the children called out in sleep, and Nora started to rise, but Samuel held her back. "I will go," he said. "You stay here and enjoy the peace." Nora watched him go inside, this man who had become her everything, and thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. She had lost so much when Thomas died, had been brought so low that she thought she might never recover. But from that lowest point had come something beautiful and unexpected. She thought about that terrified young widow in the courthouse, clutching her baby and facing the loss of everything that mattered. If she could go back and tell that woman what the future held, what would she say? That pain would transform into joy, that a stranger would become her soulmate. That love could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. Maybe she would simply say what she had learned in these years with Samuel. That life had a way of surprising you, that people were capable of remarkable kindness, and that taking a leap of faith sometimes landed you exactly where you were meant to be. Samuel came back out a few minutes later, reporting that it had been young Emma having a dream about rabbits. He settled back down beside Nora, and they remained there until the stars came out in full glory overhead, countless points of light in the vast Nebraska sky. In the years that followed, their family continued to grow and thrive. Sam became a fine young man who had his father Thomas's gentle nature and Samuel's work ethic. He eventually married a girl from Fort Kearny and built his own house on a corner of the ranch that Samuel deeded to him. Sarah grew into a beautiful young woman with a quick mind and a kind heart, who scandalized the town by insisting on going to teachers' college instead of marrying young. The younger children each found their own paths, but they all remained close to the ranch and to each other. Samuel and Nora grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. When Samuel turned 50, Nora threw him a party that brought together everyone whose lives they had touched, neighbors they had helped, ranch hands Samuel had treated fairly, families from town who had become friends. Looking around at the celebration, Samuel pulled Nora aside and told her it was the best day of his life aside from the day she agreed to marry him. When Nora turned 52, Samuel took her on a trip to San Francisco, something they had talked about for years but never managed to do. They spent 2 weeks exploring the city, eating in restaurants, seeing shows, acting like young people without a care in the world. It was a second honeymoon, a celebration of all they had built together. They returned to the ranch refreshed and ready to enjoy the next phase of their lives. Sam and his wife had given them 3 grandchildren, with more on the way. Sarah had indeed become a teacher and was making a difference in the lives of countless children. The younger children were finding their paths, some staying close to home, some venturing further afield. On a warm summer evening in 1895, 17 years after that fateful day in the courthouse, Samuel and Nora sat in the same spot on their porch where they had spent countless evenings before. Samuel was 57 now, his hair gone mostly silver but his body still strong from ranch work. Nora was 42, laugh lines around her eyes and silver streaking her dark hair. Their youngest daughter had just left to visit friends in town, and for once the house was quiet. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun go down, hands intertwined. "Do you remember the first evening we sat here together?" Samuel asked. "The night we admitted we were falling in love." "Yes. I remember thinking that I had never been so happy in my entire life. I remember feeling like everything had finally fallen into place." Nora smiled. "I remember thinking that I was the luckiest woman alive, and you know what? I still think that, every single day." Samuel raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I made you a promise that day in the courthouse, do you remember? I promised that I would do everything in my power to make you happy. Did I keep that promise?" "You kept it," Nora said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every single day you kept it. You gave me more than I ever dreamed possible. You gave me a home, a family, and a love that has sustained me through everything. You are the best man I have ever known, Samuel Stone, and I am honored to be your wife." They sat there as the stars came out, 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something beautiful together. Their love story had begun in a courthouse with a desperate widow and a cowboy willing to stand up for what was right. It had grown through patience and kindness, through hard work and shared dreams, through all the small moments that make up a life together. And as they sat there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by everything they had built, they knew that their story was not just about one dramatic day in a courthouse. It was about every day that came after, every choice they made to love each other, every challenge they faced together, every joy they shared. The cowboy had stood up in court and defended her right to her baby, had made sure the judge heard truth. But that was just the beginning. The real story was the life they built together after that day, the family they created, the love that grew deeper with each passing year. It was a story of 2 people who took a chance on each other and found something worth more than either of them had ever imagined. And they lived it fully, right up until the end of their days, grateful for that moment of courage in a dusty Nebraska courthouse that had changed both their lives forever.